Hello students, it's your history teacher and I'm here with another online lecture. The topic I will start with is Cuban Missile Crisis that happened in October 1962. The event that brought the world closest to the Third World War as ever before. As you can guess from its title, it has something to do with Cuba. So in the late 1950s, Fidel Castro, that I suppose all of you have heard about, and Che Guevara, of whom you've maybe not heard about, but you've definitely seen his picture because it's very famous, used to be on clothing, flags, and so on in like rock and roll shops because he was a revolutionary. So when you will type his name to Google, you will certainly know according to the images. These two established a communist government in Cuba. And as you know, Cuba is only 150 kilometers from the USA. So here we have a communist country in the Caribbean, very close to the United States, the superpower who has policy of containment, so wants to stop every signal of communism. So it was really not on a good way. The conflicts between the USA and the USSR escalated after the Bay of Pigs invasion. That was an unsuccessful attempt of the United States to overthrow Fidel Castro and communist regime on Cuba. So Fidel Castro and Cuban communist government were quite mad about this intervention of the United States. In 1962, the USSR, led by Nikita Khrushchev, began secretly installing nuclear missiles in Cuba that could target most of the territory of the United States. So the USSR was, of course, the ally of Cuba, as I mentioned, and they used this ally as their colony. So they used their territory, which was very close to the coast of the United States, to install these nuclear missiles and targeted them on the United States. If you don't know, missile is a guided airborne ranged weapon that can fly on its own because it's powered by jet engine or rocket motor. So the fact that it's guided is important. Well, installing of these missiles was revealed because these sites were discovered by American spy planes in October. What made President J.F. Kennedy consider options such as military invasion of Cuba, airstrikes against the missile sites, or putting pressure on the Soviet leadership so they would avoid nuclear confrontation. So these were plans that the Kennedy was considering at that time. So as you can see, there were in fact two ways: military intervention or negotiations. What Kennedy did was that he ordered a naval blockade of Cuba and publicly demanded the Soviet withdrawal of the missiles. So he left some space for the negotiations. This was really the event that brought the world on the brink of the Third World War. As you can see in the picture on the right, it was test of nerves. So you can see Kennedy and Khrushchev, how they are testing their nerves because none of them want to give up, but also none of them wants to be the first one to start the war. And in that point, when there are nuclear missiles, when there are A-bombs, it would really meant the Third World War. After several days of stalemate, threats, and secret negotiations, the Soviet Union backed down and decided to withdraw the nuclear weapons from Cuba. There were also some other conditions that US also had to withdraw their troops and weapons from some territories, but the important thing you need to know is that Cuban Missile Crisis is considered one of the most dangerous moments in the Cold War as the world was closest to the nuclear conflict. Okay, so the three most important events of the Cold War were basically Korean War, Vietnam War, and Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay, we will continue with the Palestine. I wanted to mention also this conflict, even though it's not in the curriculum, but I think it explains a lot about the nowadays situation. So this was the conflict between the state of Israel and its Arab neighbors. State of Israel was created in 1948, basically artificially, as a satisfaction for the Jews after World War II, so as a satisfaction for the Holocaust. This was the first Jewish state in 2000 years. So the Jewish nation inhabited this area, but they were defeated by the Persians and they had to leave this territory. So we can say that after 2000 years, this territory was given to them by the Allies after the World War II. And its Arab neighbors did not agree with the establishment of the State of Israel. This conflict was neither a cause nor manifestation of the Cold War tensions between the USSR and USA. However, both of these superpowers got involved in the affairs of the Middle East, and they were using these countries for their own interests. So it was not as classical example of proxy war as Korean or Vietnam War. Arab countries such as Syria or Egypt received military and political support from the Soviet Union. The United States tried to limit the Soviet influence in the region of Middle East and directly supported the State of Israel. So immediately after 1948, there was this conflict. The best example was the Yom Kippur War in 1973, on which Israel faced an uprising joint attack from Egypt and Syria, supported by the USSR. But Israel counterattacked and recaptured the Golan Heights, so even more territory from Syria. And this was mostly because of the military aid of the United States and also disorganization among the Syrian and Egyptian forces. So we can say it was a military stalemate, so no one won and no one lost. But let's say that this victory allowed Israel to continue fighting and claim a victory and its existence. So there are still conflicts that are mostly connected to religious differences, cultural differences, and the fact that this state was created artificially by the Allies as some kind of dictate. Okay, now we'll move to another topic, and it's nuclear and space race. Because during the Cold War, there was not fighting just on the military level, but also in scientific level. First, I will tell you something about nuclear race. Throughout most of the Cold War, the Americans and the Soviets tried to balance the other side in possession of nuclear weapons, so they still wanted to have the same or more as the other one. The number and destructive power of the bombs would cause the complete annihilation of both sides and turned into a strategy known as MAD, mutually assured destruction. So the fear that they will completely destroy each other and with them the whole world. The fear of MAD, so the mutually assured destruction. Please remember that I can put this into test. Like, what is MAD? And I can give you some options. So the fear of this prevented the actual using of nuclear weapons. So they were just making more and more, but both of these superpowers realized that they're not able to use it. So after this realization, the first negotiations were happening. The most important one for us was SALT I, and there was also SALT II. SALT means Strategic Arms Limitation Talks Agreement. Okay, so SALT. Remember that as well. There were 1 and 2 because the second one was follow-up meeting. So these were the negotiations between the United States and the Soviet Union, opened in 1969 in Helsinki, and it was going on for some time, to be specific, for several years. It was designed to limit both countries' stock of nuclear weapons, and this agreement was reached between two presidents of the superpowers, Richard Nixon and Leonid Brezhnev, who agreed on the limitation of strategic ballistic missiles, and treaty was signed on May 26, 1972. Remember that year as well. Okay, 1972, SALT I was signed between Richard Nixon and Leonid Brezhnev. So this is what happened with nuclear race. So first of all, they were making more and more, and then when they realized that they can't really use them, they started to negotiate about its limitation. The space race was another battlefield of technological competition for supremacy in space. During the first stages, the Soviet Union was winning. It managed to send into orbit the first artificial satellite Sputnik 1 in 1957 and the first human, Yuri Gagarin, in 1961. So this was a huge victory for the Soviet Union. So the Americans felt quite bitter about this. So they felt that they need to do something huge to overthrow that victory of the Soviets. So they sent the first humans to the moon with the Apollo 11 mission in 1969, what was the peak of the space rivalry of the Cold War. So let's say that the USSR was winning from the beginning. They made great steps, but the Americans overthrew that by the landing on the moon, which was a huge event in that time. Like everybody in the world was watching this. So these were the two most important races of the Cold War. So the military one, the nuclear and space race. So these superpowers wanted to prove that, they're better than each other. But these tensions had to end. And that's how the Détente happened. This is the last topic of today's online lecture. Most of you are probably not familiar with this expression, so I will explain it to you. It comes from French and it literally means relaxation. So relaxation of different tensions in society, for example, in this case. It means the easing of strained relations in a political situation through the dialogue, so through the negotiations and communication. It was a policy promoted by Richard Nixon, Henry Kissinger, and Leonid Brezhnev between the 1960s and 1970s. So they knew that these races had to stop, and now I will tell you why. So causes of Détente were that America was shocked by the Vietnam War and success in this war and wanted to stay out of world affairs. So again, to go more into policy of isolationism. They wanted to work on their inner affairs more. The next reason is that the arms race was very expensive for both superpowers. So both of them realized that it really has to end because they will run out of money. This technological progress, nuclear progress, it was difficult for both sides in terms of finances. And the last reason that is quite connected to the previous one is that the price of oil rocketed in the 1970s and both superpowers experienced economic problems. So these three reasons started the relaxation of the relations in Cold War. The motives the great powers had for the Détente. The first one was preventing the nuclear war because of math, and the second one creating the circumstances for the future democratic development because in the 1970s there were signals that the regimes are not sustainable for long-term period. The consequences of Détente. It caused reduction of the nuclear arsenal on both sides, on Soviet and American as well. Better relationship between United States and China, Russian and American cooperation in the space exploration, for example. So from the nuclear and space race, USSR and USA even started to cooperate in exploration of the space. So you can see the picture above the text, and it's from the Apollo-Soyuz test project, ASTP, that was realized by international mission. It was Apollo 13. The contribution of the Détente. Decline of the nuclear threat, better international relations, space for discussion and the dialogue, mutual cooperation of superpowers, and economical improvement. So it really helped to the situation. We can also distinguish types of detente, so the relaxation in different spheres of life. So American-Russian detente was, for example, political. So the example of this was SALT I Treaty and also SALT II Treaty. So the strategic arms limitation talks. Then there was scientific detente. So for example, this mission I just mentioned. So Apollo-Soyuz test project, the first international USA-USSR space mission, where Russian and American spacecraft docks that were built, and there was also sport detente. So, for example, World Table Tennis Championship in China that was quite famous. So these are the examples of the relaxation in different spheres. There was still competition, of course, but it was really more relaxed. And the last thing I want to talk about is Helsinki Agreement of 1975, which was an effort to reduce tension between the blocs, so Western Bloc and Eastern Bloc, by securing their common acceptance of the post-World War II status quo in Europe. The Helsinki Final Act, that was signed as the peace, dealt with a variety of issues divided into 4 baskets, so 4 fields. The first basket was about political and military issues, like territorial disputes, arms, borders, and so on. The second basket was about economic issues, the third basket about human and civil rights, and the fourth basket was about organization, so there were details for follow-up meetings, so about real procedures, so how it will look like in practice, okay? I will also show you some more pictures from the detente. So the first picture I will talk about is on the left, so you can see, let's say, the progress of the detente. So there's nuclear non-proliferation treaty that I didn't mention. Then there's US table tennis in China. China joins the United Nations. Nixon visits China. SALT I Treaty signed. Helsinki Agreement and Russian and American spacecraft docks. So this is how it went chronologically, but for me it's important that you will know what the detente is, examples of political, scientific, and sport detente, and so on. This can be a good help for you. And the second picture, the picture on the right, is caricature about detente as well. And it shows that Soviet people were in fact excluded from this. So the USSR was still the same, so it would not allow any changes in its satellites. So it was relaxed to the USA, but there was still internal problems. So that's the main message. Okay, and as always, I will do a quick revision of this topic. So, from the beginning, what you should know, that the Cuban Missile Crisis happened in October 1962, after in 1950s Fidel Castro and Che Guevara established a communist government in Cuba that is really close to the USA. USA didn't like that and organized unsuccessful invasion to the Bay of Pigs to Cuba. That meant to overthrow Fidel Castro. Then in 1962, Nikita Khrushchev became secretly installing nuclear missiles in Cuba and targeted them to the USA. These sites were discovered by American spy planes, and JF Kennedy ordered a naval blockade of Cuba and publicly demanded the Soviet withdrawal of the missiles. After several days of stalemate, threats, and secret negotiations, the USSR backed down and decided to withdraw. This was the most dangerous moment in the Cold War because the world was the closest to a nuclear conflict. Palestine was the conflict between the State of Israel and Arab neighbors, and it was not a manifestation of the Cold War tensions between these two superpowers, but they both got involved in the affairs of the Middle East. Syria and Egypt were supported by the USSR, and Israel was supported by the United States. The best example of this conflict was Yom Kippur War in 1973, on which Israel faced an uprising joint attack from Egypt and Syria, supported by the USSR. Israel counterattacked, and thanks to military help from the US and also disorganization among the Syrian and Egyptian forces, it ended in a military stalemate. And after that, Israel continued fighting for the victory and for its existence. Nuclear and space race was a competition between the two superpowers. Both of these sides realized that the complete annihilation would happen after the use of nuclear bombs. So the fear of MAD prevented the actual using of nuclear weapons. MAD means mutually assured destruction. So they started to negotiate in SALT 1 and SALT 2. SALT means Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. These were negotiations between the US and the USSR that were designed to limit both countries' stock of nuclear weapons, and the agreement was reached between Nixon and Brezhnev. It was signed on May 26, 1972. The space race was another battlefield of technological competition for supremacy between these two blocs, and during the first stages of this race, USSR was winning, but the American space program overthrew them in the end. The USSR sent into orbit the first artificial satellite Sputnik 1 in 1957 and the first human Yuri Gagarin in 1961. The Americans sent the first humans to the moon with the Apollo 11 mission in 1969. This is considered to be the peak of the space rivalry of the Cold War. Détente means relaxation, so easing of strained relations in a political situation through the dialogue. It was promoted by Nixon, Kissinger, and Brezhnev between the 1960s and 1970s. There were three main causes. America was shocked by the Vietnam War and wanted to stay out of the world affairs. The arms race was very expensive, and the price of oil rocketed in the 1970s, so both of these superpowers were in economic problems. The motives the great powers had for the Détente was preventing the nuclear war and creating the circumstances for the future democratic development. Consequences were reduction of the nuclear arsenal of the both sides, better relationship between USA and China, Russian and American cooperation in the space exploration. The contribution of the Détente, decline of the nuclear threat, better international relations, space for discussion and dialogue, mutual cooperation of superpowers, economical improvement. There was political Détente, represented by SALT Treaty, scientific Détente, represented by Apollo-Soyuz test project, and sport Détente, represented by World Table Tennis Championship in China. Helsinki Agreement was signed in 1975 by the Helsinki Final Act, and it reduced tensions between these two blocs. It consisted of a variety of issues divided into four baskets. The first basket was about political and military issues, the second basket about economic issues, the third basket human rights, and the fourth basket details for follow-up meetings. So that's it. I hope you all study on regular basis, because I think in 2 weeks we will write small tests, so you should start to study. If you still need me to explain something into further details, you can contact me anytime. If not, until the next online lecture, bye.